and feel as if going to church for an hour a week somehow makes it all better. The truth of it is, God is dead in the sense that we don't believe in him anymore, even if we claim to. But contrary to Kierkegaard's aspiration, which is to reinvent and reinvigorate Christianity in his own terms, Nietzsche would just as soon be done with it. And God is dead then also becomes a kind of statement about the future of the modern world. In one of his best and most encompassing books, The Gay Science, he has a madman appear in the marketplace who announces not only God is dead, but we have killed him. And interesting, the people who there watch him with amusement actually laugh at him, make fun of him, say, where is God? He got lost. What happened to him? But of course, the point is that God is dead in our world, and nevertheless, we are yet incapable of understanding what we have done. In his most famous piece of fiction, a kind of very, well, in a way, I would say excessive, quasi-biblical parody, which is called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche reintroduces a character from the ancient world, the founder of the religion of Zoroastrianism, also the character who in many ways was responsible for an important piece of the Judeo-Christian tradition, namely the division between good and evil, a dichotomy that Nietzsche is going to be much concerned with his philosophy. Zarathustra essentially invented that along with the Manichaeans, and he essentially said that the world is the battle of two different sets of forces. Put it in a different way, it's a way of saying that morality really requires a metaphysical picture, that it isn't just a matter of subjective feelings, it's not just a matter of culture or opinion, but the difference between good and evil is something that is true of the world. And Zarathustra, in this long book, essentially urges us to get over that dichotomy which he himself once introduced. He also urges us to get rid of these ideals of the otherworldly. And if Zarathustra has a philosophy, it's Nietzsche's style. It's Nietzsche's philosophy. Namely, it is this world and this life and this world and this life only that really count. The notion of God as dead has a much more general meaning, though. And this is where I think it becomes particularly important philosophically. There is a sense in which the monotheism of Judeo-Christian tradition is of a piece with a kind of monistic obsession that the ancient Greeks shared as well. The beginning of philosophy in the West, often attributed to the first philosophers in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, is basically the search for the one basic element, or using Aristotle's term, the one basic substance which makes up everything. You find this metaphysical obsession not just in Greece, but also the place where much of Greek philosophy may have originally come from, towards India and South Asia, where the notion of Brahman, for example, in Hinduism, is also this emphasis on the oneness of the world. There's this rage for unity that we have, and that rage for unity manifests itself, among other places, in our belief in the monotheistic God. It's interesting to note, for example, that in the Old Testament, it's not as if there is only one God. The ancient Hebrews pictured their God as opposed to other gods, and in, for example, some of the most famous stories in the Old Testament, it becomes a kind of a contest to see which God is bigger and tougher and stronger than the others. But with the kind of monotheism that has certainly come to define the Judeo-Christian tradition since, what we find is not just the emphasis on one God, but a kind of emphasis on one world, which Nietzsche wants to overcome. It's a metaphysical picture that has all kinds of manifestations. It's in science. After all, Einstein, this century, died looking for a unified theory. And it has always been the aim of science to give us not just truths or true theories in this realm or that, but to give us ultimately a single picture which would tie it all together. This is tied to Nietzsche's rejection of the otherworldly, and this explains too why Nietzsche is so concerned to reject the great philosophers of the ancient world, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates in particular. Nietzsche's relation to Socrates is rather complicated. I would say ultimately Socrates is his hero and he envies him. Nevertheless, he bitterly attacks him all the way through. And the reason is because it's really Socrates who invents the notion of the other world. Now that might sound a little strange because you think of the Egyptians and you think of the earlier Greeks with their concept of Hades and so on. But there's a sense in which it's really Socrates who gets the idea of the soul in another world, which is still robust. I mean, Socrates fantasizes, for example, in one of his early dialogues, that he could go on doing philosophy forever as a pure soul. What Nietzsche wants to say is, it's Socrates because of his own hatred of life, and he goes into that in some detail. It's Socrates who insists that we think about other possibilities, other worlds. And Plato, of course, follows him and turns this into one of the more sophisticated metaphysics in our tradition. But the basic idea of the otherworldly, which leads quite directly into the Christian notion of heaven and hell, is something that Nietzsche says now has to be put aside. And what we have to do is understand our world in a different way. He accuses Socrates, among other things, of a kind of tyranny of reason, introducing another plot which is going to be very central to Nietzsche's philosophy. I mentioned with Kierkegaard in particular that to understand his concept of existence and understand his concept of subjective truth, what was important was to particularly understand the importance of the passions. It's really the passions that make life meaningful. It's the passions that define us as who we are. And it's an interesting question with that as a backdrop to ask where the emphasis, one might say, the obsession with reason in philosophy comes from. And Nietzsche thinks he's found the source. It's Socrates. Socrates was very unhappy, according to Nietzsche, with his world. He was very unhappy with certainly the political state of Athens, but perhaps more personally, Nietzsche says outrageously, he was unhappy with his looks. He says in one of his last books, quite bluntly, Socrates was ugly, and ugliness among the Athenians was virtually a refutation. It's an outrageous claim, something I'll talk about a bit later, that very idea of an ad hominem argument in philosophy. But the idea is that Socrates was looking for an escape. And consequently, what he did was essentially he constrained his passions. He constrained himself, and instead took everything that he spoke as a matter of reason. It was all in defense of reason. And Nietzsche thinks that although this sounds perfectly secular and so on, after all, the Enlightenment was a rejection of religion in the name of reason, nevertheless, Nietzsche comes to say that reason itself can be its own kind of escape from life, its own sense of the otherworldly. As he says in one of his pithier aphorisms, Christianity really is just Platonism for the masses. All of which leads to the question about what Nietzsche himself really believes and what he thinks is true. I said that he defends life as the ultimate value, but nevertheless, he is so thoroughly skeptical, so thoroughly challenging, so thoroughly concerned with nihilism as a problem, that one might very well ask, what room is left for truth? And especially once you reject the idea of monotheism and that image of the one reality behind all of the appearances. There's a very real question whether we can ever get beyond the appearances, whether we can ever, in fact, get something that's true. Well, there's a sense in which Nietzsche adopts something which we might call, with some caution, epistemological nihilism. To put it in a blunt phrase, it's the idea that there is no truth. Now, this could be taken as a kind of total skepticism of the sort that we've seen in other philosophers earlier in history. But that's not Nietzsche's intent. In fact, I think one way to put it, rather banally, is to say there is no truth, but there are lots of truths. What we call truth, in particular what we call that special notion of truth that philosophers are seeking and that religious thinkers find in God or in Brahman, what we call truth, in fact, are just our interpretations of the world. He says, for example, that there are no facts, there are only interpretations. He says that what we call truth are just those errors that we cannot give up. with reference to someone like Kant. He wants to say, when Kant talks about necessary truths, a priori truths, truths that are essential in the very structure of the human mind,